there's this lovely way in which Macarius of Egypt, he's one of the Desert Fathers, speaks of this. It's on page 97 for those who might be interested in following. It's at the very top. And he talks about all of this grappling with demons happening in this little space, as he calls it, this tiny space which we know of as the heart. And he says this: "The heart itself is only a small vessel, yet dragons are there and lions. There are poisonous beasts and all the treasures of evil. There are rough and uneven roads. There are precipices, but there too are God and the angels. Life is there and the kingdom, and there too is light. And there the apostles and heavenly cities and treasures of grace. All things lie within that one little space." So all the ascetical practices that we're going to be talking about today, or the whole notion of asceticism, happens in the little space of our own hearts. This is key for us to remember. I think it's safe to say, and I'll read a lovely quote from a British Carmelite nun, Ruth Burrows, who basically says, look, all of our ascetical practices are designed certainly for us to fail, but they are designed to free us to love. The more attached we are to our addictions or our habitual tendencies or all of the things that restrain us, the less free we are to love. So the whole point of asceticism is love of neighbor. That's what it boils down to. What does that then mean for us to love neighbor, and how do we practice various ascetical practices to that end? So one of the things I attempt to do throughout this chapter is talk about the anatomy of a demon, or rather of what I cast as two different groups of demons. And the first group I refer to as the renegades, because they act in us very much like unruly teenagers who strike at our most base natures for pleasure, to avoid pain, all of those places where we might be tempted along the lines of moving away from anything that we would find uncomfortable, anything that we would find difficult to grapple with, and instead exploit our desire for pleasure. So as I was saying in the opening paragraphs, if evil looked the way the medievals depicted it, dragons and jaws and hooved beasts and all of this, we would all clearly be saints because we'd all be clearly running in the opposite direction. But the fact is that evil is really beautiful and seductive and sexy, right? I mean, think about the Marlboro Man, right, on his horse, all burly, puffing on a cigarette, and just, a real man's man, until he's in his hospital bed dying of lung cancer. But nobody filmed that part, you see. So it's the veneer, which is true, by the way. That's a fact. And so it's the veneer of, you can be like him if you smoke, Marlboro or whatever he was advertising. But you don't see the whole picture, right? It always comes as half-truth. Always comes as half-truth, right? This is, again, going back to the whispering serpent. Did God really say you couldn't eat? You see? So there's always a half-truth, and there's always the veneer of seduction, always the veneer of beauty. Now, I describe the idea that despite what the head of that dragon looks like for you, because it's always going to look like something that goes after your Achilles heel, and it's going to look different to me, it's going to go after my Achilles heel. If you trace the contours of the body, you will see there's only one tail. It's all one origin. I left a picture there of that idea. I have a little medieval depiction of that very idea in your handout there for today. So I want you to understand then how renegades are seductive. So let me look with you on page 98. Read a little bit about what that looks like. If you look, let's start in the middle of page 99. It'll be easier, I think, more clear if I just read to you what I've already succinctly sort of spelled out than try to explain. So in the middle of 99, the renegades consume us like spiritual cancers, unskilled and bent on our destruction, usually emerging from the cracks of unhealed psychological wounds, emotional trauma, or addictive tendencies. The havoc they wreak is most often quite evident for the world to see. Lives destroyed by substance abuse, sex addiction, rage, greed, and compulsive patterns of behavior that all but destroy one's capacity to live integrated, productive, and meaningful lives. Like renegade teenagers, they tap into our most base adolescent impulses, demanding instant gratification and stunting our capacity to mature into the more sublime joys of emotional and spiritual adulthood. When triumphant, these demons reduce us to little more than a shadow of our former selves, isolated from family and society, full of shame, remorse, and self-deprecation. This pattern entrenches us more deeply in the very addictions that have now become our only source of pleasure, or at least of temporary relief from the inner state of anguish. The only thing worse than the addiction itself is the prospect of freeing ourselves from it. Like Israel being led through the wilderness by Moses, the promised land seems too far off. Anything would be better than wandering through the desert wasteland of our hearts, not knowing where our emotional sustenance will come from next. You see, so this is key for us to remember. For those of you familiar with the story of Exodus, as they leave their enslavement under Pharaoh and are brought into a wildering and bewildering experience on their way to the promised land for some 40 years. They grumble, and they grumble a lot. And there's that telling line where they say finally to him, look, we're eating this manna constantly. We have nothing but a few quail here and there. We don't know what the next day will bring. We want to go back. Where there we had a roof over our head. There was predictability. We had our cucumbers and our garlic and our onions. You see, we like our addictions. That's why they're so hard to overcome. Even though they only might provide for us a half-life, it's easier very often to live a half-life than the promise of a fuller life, because of the journey between here and there just seems too long, too great. Do you follow? So this is key for us to understand that seduction is seduction because it's easy, right? And our tendency is to go to that easiest place rather than to strive for something better. And this was the struggle of ancient Israel, actually wanting Moses to take them back to Egypt, where they had that predictability. But the journey is long to the promised land and difficult at times, because we are taught, we are weaned off of those attachments, those addictions, in order to learn what it means to trust God alone. Manna and quail. The difficult journey. So that's the first type of temptation. And these demons come out of our places of woundedness, where because of childhood trauma or pain or neglect, or the ways in which the hammers of hell could come down on us in the course of life, the death of a loved one, we turn to things that self-medicate. We turn to alcohol. We turn to turn inward on ourselves rather than reach out to others. And within that, our weaknesses are exploited. Right? One of the things that I think is consistent here that people recognize is whatever it is, this demon that I'm struggling with feels disconnected, disjointed, somewhat alien to the person I either want to be or the person that people think that I am. So there's that isolating tendency. So I want to then speak to the second group of demons, and maybe we can have a broader discussion about these, which this other group I call parasites. And while they don't have the overt capacity to destroy us the way that the renegades seem to, driving us, for example, all the way to Skid Row. We do see here what I think is the far more dangerous forms of demons, because they come not out of our places of woundedness, but out of our complacency and our desire to maintain the status quo. And it's a very strong desire. Let's take a look at 100, if you would. I'm looking at the third paragraph down, middle of the page. Yet the overt and blundering destruction left in the wake of these renegades pales in comparison to those more lethal still who have honed the skill of coexistence with us. Like clever little parasites, they make their home in us, comfortably existing alongside our virtues, and cunning enough to leave us in stasis. Their aim is not that we should self-destruct, but something far more insidious, that we should become ordinary, that we should be neutralized or worse, co-opted in service of the powers of this present darkness. Better that we should remain complacent in the face of our hypocrisies and the world's injustices. Better that we should find ourselves just comfortable enough to lack the motivation to challenge the status quo of our interior lives, the state of the world, and the plight of others. The last thing a parasitic demon wants is for us to engage in any real self-examination that might spark an inner conversion or moral uprising, especially one that leads to greater self-awareness or deeper solidarity with the oppressed or marginalized. They much prefer a host who is content enough to make for themselves an acceptable life without ever realizing what it means to live to the full, to exist but never to thrive, to be just content enough, busy enough, distracted enough, or sedentary enough to do nothing in the face of evil. While most of us will never be counted among the infamous tyrants or conspicuous villains of history, the only moral climate these demons need to flourish is one that renders us extraordinarily mediocre. Spiritual parasites are the most difficult to recognize because they are so adept at discretion. These demons do not emerge from places of brokenness or trauma, quite the opposite. They rise up from our experience of comfort and the desire to maintain it. They walk with ease through the sprawling suburbs of our interior life, where comfort and convenience are readily at hand. They are like perfect tenants who pay their rent on time, thrive in a swept and tidy house, and always manage to maintain a low profile. They are quiet and unassuming, lest they draw our attention to their shrewd handiwork. They befriend us just enough that we feel no compulsion to call their presence into question, much less evict them from our lives. In fact, if we are honest, we might secretly admit to enjoying their company. They are helpful and flattering, willing to go the extra mile to please us and display a near-perfect etiquette, having mastered the language of spiritual decorum and social civility. So I want to read just one more paragraph because this is where we see the transition, I think. It's grappling with these demons, where we see the transition between the inner work of asceticism and the contemplative engagement with social transformation. So pay attention. Their symbiotic appeal is a simple but time-honored strategy that has worked since the dawn of humanity. Like the serpent of Eden, they know how to present the perfect blend of truth and lies. They know how to put our consciences at ease with token actions that never really transform society, but nevertheless exonerate us from feeling the need to try. They whisper, "Give this homeless person $1, or better, buy her a meal so she cannot use the money for drugs." Any impulse to reach across economic boundaries, to befriend her, to forge a relationship, is thwarted before we can form it into a fully articulated idea. Thus, what I have really done is purchased a ticket to a freer conscience. I feel much better about myself as I pass her every day on the same street corner. I have done my part. In the end, she remains homeless, and I sleep soundly at night. Perfect. I'm aware of the beautiful parable that Jesus tells that we know often as the Good Samaritan. And this last paragraph is reflective of that. I mean, you have to understand that the relationship between Jews and Samaritans were profoundly hostile ever since a civil war that happened centuries before Christ, where in the north, in Samaria, there was intermarrying with Gentiles. They didn't have the temple, and the one that they built was seen as idolatrous to the south, or the Judeans and so forth. And nor did they then have the same puritanical codes or rules that the Judeans had in the south. So when Jesus from the south is speaking about this, the last thing one would expect is that the Samaritan does the right thing. But this is exactly what he shows. So when the priest and the Levite pass the man left for dead, they don't do so because they're mean people or evil. They do so because their religious obligations prevented them from becoming contaminated by touching a potentially dead person. It would have required extensive ritual purity for them to get back into a position where they could perform their duties. So it's religious obligation that leads them to pass the Samaritan, you see. The man left on the side. But the Samaritan, who is not beholden to those purity codes, is freed. And he does the right thing. He takes the man to an inn, feeds him, gives him a place to rest, and pays the innkeeper to nurture him back to health. So when Jesus says, who did the right thing, any Jew at the time hearing that would have had to swallow hard to admit that it was the Samaritan. The point that Jesus wants to make is that any religious observance that does not result in compassion isn't worth keeping. That our religious observances can and often do become the excuses we make not to do the compassionate thing, the right thing. As we'll see Ruth Burrow saying, all of our ascetical practices is about love of neighbor. This is what the Samaritan understood. Now, when we are walking past that homeless woman, we are doing not what the Samaritan did, really. We are doing what the priest and the Levite did. We might not be using religious excuses, but the way that these parasitic demons work is to keep us quelled, to keep us at ease, to keep us from feeling too distraught when I go to bed at night, from wondering, where is she now? I did my part. Here's your $1. So this is precisely where we get squirmy, because on many levels we understand that we live in a world where we make choices, where we can't do everything for everyone. And one of the things that we have to understand as we're working, and we'll see this in my final presentation on becoming prayer, is that as part of the theology of understanding ourselves as members of Christ's body, helps us to avoid two dangerous polarities. One is the idea that the crises we face are so overwhelming that I become paralyzed, not knowing where to even begin. That's a temptation, and it's real. And the other is the overbearing thought that it all is on my shoulders, that I have to save the world personally from climate change, that I have to, be the person to head racial reconciliation in our country, whatever that case may be. It's that opposite end that I can't do anything and I have to do everything. And those are dangerous extremes. And as we'll talk about, there's a way through that, through our meditative practice, to understand that. But in the short of it is, you can't do nothing. And you can't do everything, but all of us have to do something. And the question is, what is the something that we have to do? It is not for you personally to resolve the crisis of homelessness throughout our country, but where are you in your life, and what can you do from that platform to make a change, real change, not the kind that just pacifies us, right, to make us feel better. So, all the tyrants of history, all that they need is for the rest of us to do nothing. That's what it boils down to. So, how is it that we discern through inner engagement, right, with my own demons, whether that's born of my trauma and wounds or of my complacency and comfort, renegades and parasites? How do I discern where through that the clarity of the voice of Christ comes through? This is the work of asceticism.